Most folks in that wide stretch of dry land said a woman living alone had no business helping strangers, especially not a wounded Apache warrior. They said times were tense, that fear traveled faster than the wind rolling across the hills, and that kindness toward the wrong person could turn a quiet homestead into a place whispered about for years. But she had never been the sort to let fear make choices for her. From the moment she stepped off the small wagon that brought her to this lonely edge of the frontier, she had learned to rely on her own judgment even when neighbors questioned her sense. The fields around her cabin were still young, barely holding their first strong crops. Yet she carried herself with the calm steadiness of someone who had been living off the land long before she arrived, the night everything changed started like any other. The sky hung low with a dim gray light, the kind that comes right before a storm. She was finishing the last chore of the day when she heard a sound near the tree line. It was not the cry of a coyote or the shuffle of a deer. It was heavy, uneven, almost desperate. When she stepped outside with her lantern raised, she saw him collapse near the fence that separated her field from the wild brush. A tall Apache warrior, scarred across his face and shoulder, breathing hard as if each breath hurt. His long black hair was tangled with dust, and his clothing showed signs of travel far beyond anything the settlers around her ever attempted. She froze at first, not out of fear, but out of the shock of seeing someone so close to death and yet still fighting to stay upright. The stories people told about Apache warriors were endless, some based on truth, others fueled by tension between the communities. Still, what she saw in front of her was not a threat. It was a human being in pain. When he lifted his head, their eyes met for a moment that felt longer than it was. There was no anger in his expression, no demand. Only exhaustion. She ran to him before doubt had any chance to settle in. By the time she reached him, he was too weak to explain anything. She tried helping him inside, but his weight nearly pulled both of them to the ground. She managed to drag him onto the porch and then inside her cabin with slow, steady movements. Every step reminded her she lived alone, with no one to call and no one to turn to if something went wrong. Yet something inside her kept pushing her forward. The world outside felt wide and loud, but the small cabin held a quiet sincerity she had shaped with her own hands. She chose to let him in because her heart told her it was the only right thing to do. Her cabin held only one bed. A simple wooden frame with a thin mattress she had saved for months to buy from a traveling wagon. It was the one comfort she allowed herself in a life built mostly by hard work and early mornings. But as she looked at the wounded warrior struggling even to breathe, she knew he would not last the night on the floor. She guided him to the bed, steadying him when he nearly fell again. His breathing eased once he finally lay down. She stood by the edge, unsure what to say or do next. His scars caught the glow of her lantern, each one marking some past struggle she could only imagine. The silence between them carried a strange pull, something calm yet powerful, as if life had suddenly twisted their paths together for a reason she could not understand. Yet she spent the night tending to him, cleaning the wound on his shoulder and covering him with her only good blanket. He never spoke, not even once. Whether he did not know her language or simply lacked the strength, she could not tell. Still, she felt he understood her intentions. She moved quietly around the cabin, offering water, adjusting the blanket, checking his breath. She gave up any thought of sleep, telling herself she could rest once he was safe. Hours passed and she kept her lantern dim to save oil. Listening to the soft rhythm of wind outside and the slow breathing of the stranger she had chosen to help. By morning, the storm that had threatened never came. Instead, a soft orange glow seeped into the cabin, warming the wooden floorboards. The Apache warrior's eyes opened with more clarity than the night before. He looked around slowly, then toward her, trying to rise despite the pain. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his arm, urging him to stay still. He hesitated, then lowered himself again, accepting the help. She brought him warm water and a bit of broth she had prepared. He drank without protest, though each movement seemed to cost him effort. Days passed with a quiet rhythm she found surprisingly natural. He healed slowly, gaining strength bit by bit. He never overstayed her kindness or acted in any way that made her uneasy. He moved with a disciplined calm, even while injured, and showed gratitude in the smallest gestures. Sometimes she caught him watching the fields through the open window, as though studying the land with a memory she could not reach. The longer he stayed, the less he felt like a stranger. She learned that presence could speak louder than words, and that trust did not always need translation. Still, she knew he could not stay forever. The frontier was full of unwritten rules, and the arrival of an Apache man in a settler woman's home would spread like wildfire if anyone found out. She told herself she had only helped someone in need, that once he was well enough to travel, their paths would part again. But each morning when she saw him sitting on the porch, breathing in the cool air as if gathering strength, she felt a strange pull she did not want to examine too closely. On the morning he finally stood without wincing, she sensed the moment had come. He picked up the small satchel he carried when he first arrived and adjusted it over his shoulder. She walked him to the edge of the field, unsure what to say. He turned to her, placing his hand briefly over his chest in a gesture that felt like a quiet thank you. She nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat, then watched him disappear into the trees as silently as he had arrived. Her cabin suddenly felt much quieter. She returned to her chores, telling herself life would go back to normal. Yet something settled deep inside her, a mix of warmth and worry, as if helping him had set something in motion she could not see yet. Days passed, then weeks. She kept tending her fields, cooking her meals, and managing the small tasks of daily life. But she often found herself glancing toward the tree line, sensing something was coming even if she could not explain it. The change arrived one early morning when she stepped outside and felt the ground almost hum beneath her feet. A sound rose from the distance, steady and rhythmic, carried on the wind. She squinted toward the hills, her heart tightening. Shapes began to appear, one after another, moving with purpose. Not one warrior, not two, but an entire Apache camp making its way into her field. Her breath caught in her chest as she counted more figures approaching than she had ever seen in one place. At the front of the group stood the scarred warrior she had given her only bed to. His eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. She stood frozen as the camp filled her field. Realizing that the moment she offered kindness to a stranger had opened a door that would change her life in ways she had never imagined, she stood still for what felt like a long moment, trying to understand what she was seeing as more Apache families stepped into her field. The tall warrior she had sheltered stood at the front of them, calm but unreadable. The sun behind him painted his figure in a warm glow, highlighting the scars on his shoulder, the long dark hair moving gently in the breeze, and the quiet authority in the way he held himself. She had known he carried strength, but he had never shown this kind of presence while healing in her cabin. Out here, surrounded by his people, he looked like someone shaped by responsibility she had never guessed at. Her first instinct was to step back, but her boots remained rooted to the ground. She did not feel threatened, only overwhelmed by the sight of so many people appearing without warning. Her field, once quiet with rows of young crops, now held tents being carried in, baskets of supplies, horses moving with steady breaths, and faces watching her with curiosity rather than hostility. The children looked at her with wide eyes, adults with thoughtful ones, and elders with expressions softened by time. The warrior walked forward until only a few steps separated them. She could feel her heart pushing against her ribs, unsure if she should speak. He lifted his hand slightly, not as a warning but as a calm gesture meant to reassure. For a moment, it felt like the world settled around them, even though her mind was full of questions she could not form into words. He looked at her with the same quiet intensity she had seen in her cabin, the kind that told her he had returned not by accident. She finally managed to find her voice, though it trembled. She told him she had not expected him to come back with so many people. His eyes softened at her tone, and he glanced toward the group behind him. He said a few words in his own language, and an older woman stepped forward. The woman had strong lines across her face, the kind that came from years of endurance and leadership. She spoke slowly in a mixture of English and her own tongue. Her voice carried steady warmth when she explained that the warrior had spoken of the kindness he had received from the woman living alone in the field. He had told them she had saved his life when many others would have turned him away. The older woman's words were gentle, but the weight of them settled deep in the air. She explained that the warrior belonged to a respected family in their band, that the scars on his face and shoulder came from a recent conflict far from the settlement. He had been separated from his group and wandered injured for days before reaching the woman's land. His return to them, alive and able to stand, was no small thing. They had come not only for him, but to show respect to the one who had given him safety, even as the older woman spoke. The woman felt the unease growing inside her. Respect from an Apache camp was not something the settlers nearby would understand. Some would fear it, others would twist the story until it sounded like trouble. She could almost hear the whispers that would spread if anyone saw what was happening in her field. The quiet life she had built, the crops she worked so hard for, the peace she had learned to maintain, all felt suddenly fragile. Yet she also felt a pull of something else. A sense that this was bigger than anything she had planned for, that the warrior's return meant the path ahead was shifting whether she liked it or not. The older woman finished speaking and stepped back. The warrior looked at her again and said something short but meaningful in his language. She did not understand the words, but the weight of them felt clear. He looked thankful, sincere, and serious all at once. She tried to respond with a small, uncertain smile. She wanted to ask what they intended to do in her field, how long they planned to stay, and whether bringing an entire camp here put all of them in danger, but her voice would not lift past the knot in her throat. As the Apache camp began to settle, she stepped back toward her cabin. It felt strange to turn her back on so many people, but she stayed within sight, watching the movement of families spreading across her land. They set up their tents with practiced ease. Children ran toward small groups of horses tied neatly along the fence line, and elders carried woven baskets filled with herbs she had never seen before. None acted in aggression. They organized themselves with a quiet grace that left her both amazed and worried. She returned to her porch and sat down, rubbing her palms against her skirt to steady her nerves. The warrior eventually approached and stood at the bottom of her steps. His presence felt different now, more commanding but still respectful. He spoke softly, trying to assure her they meant no harm. Through simple words and gestures, he explained they would stay only for a short time. They needed a place to rest, regroup, and honor the fact that he had survived. Her land happened to be the safest, quiet space between territories. She listened, absorbing every word, though the tension inside her remained. She wanted to believe his assurance, but she had lived long enough on the frontier to know that peace was not something guaranteed. The presence of an Apache camp so close to a settler homestead could draw unwanted attention. She thought of the few neighbors that lived miles away and how quickly fear could stir them into rash decisions. She imagined a group of riders approaching with questions that might not end well. The frontier was unpredictable, and misunderstandings were dangerous, yet when she looked back at the camp she did not see chaos or threat. She saw families cooking over small fires, older women weaving, young men sharpening tools or tending to horses. She saw life unfolding in a rhythm different from hers, but not frightening. The warrior stood quietly beside her porch, patient and steady. His injuries had healed enough that he no longer moved with discomfort. The scars remained, but they seemed less harsh under the warm daylight. She asked him softly why he had returned instead of traveling with his people to safety. He glanced toward the camp, then back at her as if choosing his answer with care. He said he had given his word that he would return to thank her properly, and a promise was something he did not take lightly. The simple honesty in his voice struck her in a way she did not expect. She looked away quickly, trying to collect her thoughts. But her heart felt unsteady again. As the day went on, she could not help noticing small details. The older woman who had spoken earlier kept watching both her and the warrior with an expression that held more meaning than she could grasp. Some of the younger men looked at her homestead with curiosity, perhaps surprised by her strength to manage it alone. The children seemed fascinated by her well, taking turns peering into the stone ring around it. Nothing about their behavior felt threatening, yet she still felt caught between two worlds. One was the quiet life she had shaped for herself. The other was a larger, deeper story she had stepped into when she opened her door to a wounded stranger. As the sun began to set, the Apache camp glowed softly under the warm orange light. Fires flickered across her field, sending gentle trails of smoke into the air. She stood on her porch again, watching the gathering unfold. The warrior remained near his people, speaking quietly with a few others. But every now and then he glanced toward her cabin with an expression she could not decipher. It was not impatience or expectation. It was something far more complicated, something that made her pulse quicken even when she tried to ignore it. She knew the next days would not be simple. The presence of the camp would bring questions, dangers, and decisions she had never imagined having to make. But even with the uncertainty hanging over her, she could not shake the sense that the warrior's return meant her life had shifted in a direction that could not be undone. When night finally settled and the stars appeared, she stood alone outside her cabin, staring at the camp that filled her field. The quiet hum of distant voices and the steady crackle of firewood carried through the night air. Everything felt unfamiliar yet strangely natural at the same time. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cool wind and wondered what tomorrow would bring, knowing deep inside that nothing about her life would ever be the same again. The next morning, the woman woke with a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. She had spent half the night listening to the steady murmur of voices from the Apache camp and the soft crackle of fires burning in her field. The sound had been strangely peaceful, but it also reminded her that nothing about this situation could stay peaceful if the outside world found out. Life on the frontier had taught her that news did not travel in a straight line. It twisted, changed, and picked up fear along the way. She stepped outside and saw the camp already awake. Smoke curled gently from cooking fires, and the smell of roasted corn and herbs drifted across the cold morning air. Children chased each other between horses, and a few men repaired tack and checked weapons with practiced movements. Women worked over pots and baskets, turning simple ingredients into hearty meals. The scene did not look like a war party preparing to attack. It looked like families trying to live. Still, she knew that if a settler rode over the next ridge and saw this sight, they would not see what she saw. The scarred Apache warrior stood near the fence line, speaking with an older man whose presence seemed as solid as the hills in the distance. The older man looked like a leader. His eyes were sharp, his hair streaked with gray, and his calm gaze never missed a detail. From the way others gave him space and turned slightly when he moved, she understood that he carried authority in the camp. She wondered what he thought of her land, her cabin, and the chance she had taken on one of his people. As she filled her water bucket at the well, the warrior approached the porch. His steps were steady, his injuries now only a memory carved into his scars. He greeted her in simple English, just enough for them to understand one another. Over the past days he had picked up more words than she realized. He told her quietly that the leader of their band wanted to speak with her. The words tightened something inside her, but she nodded and set the bucket down. Wiping her damp hands on her skirt, they walked together toward the center of the camp. She felt every pair of eyes follow them, not with open mistrust, but with focused interest. The older man waited near a low fire, sitting on a blanket with his legs folded. When they reached him, he rose to his feet in a slow, controlled motion. There was dignity in the way he moved, as though every gesture said something about who he was. He spoke first to the warrior in their language, then turned his attention to her. The leader used a mix of Apache and careful English, with the warrior translating where needed. He spoke of the land around them, how it had once belonged fully to his people before lines were drawn on maps by others. He spoke of tensions with nearby settlements, of broken promises and misunderstandings. He did not spit out anger or blame, but there was a deep weariness in his voice that came from many seasons of loss. Then he spoke of her act of kindness. A woman alone on the frontier had opened her door, given shelter and even her only bed to a wounded Apache warrior, and had asked for nothing in return. The leader said such choices did not pass unnoticed. Among his people, saving the life of a warrior carried a weight of honor. It was not something they could ignore. They had come to this field to give thanks, but also to decide their next move. He said the land nearby was changing faster than any of them liked. Soldiers were moving through more often, and new settlers were cutting into hunting grounds. They needed a place to rest and plan, even if only for a short time. Her land, quiet and open, stood in the middle of it all. His words did not sound like a threat, yet the meaning underneath made her throat tighten. The Apache camp needed a safe place, and her field had become that place. But she knew the settlers, the sheriff, and whoever else thought they had a say in this land would not see it that way. The conflict gathering on the horizon was not just between two groups. It was now tied to her small cabin, her quiet life, and the scarred warrior who watched the leader with respect as they spoke. A young Apache boy suddenly ran past them, chasing a dog that had grabbed a scrap of cloth. The boy tripped and nearly fell into her. Without thinking, she reached out and steadied him by the shoulders. He looked up at her with wide, startled eyes, then gave a shy smile before darting away again. The simple moment sank into her chest. These were not faceless enemies. They were children, elders, families. But she also knew that if armed men rode up, they would not stop to notice any of that. Later that day, she returned to her chores, though her hands moved slower than usual. As she fed the chickens and checked the rows of young plants, her mind circled the same questions. How long would the camp stay? What would happen when neighbors noticed smoke from more fires than usual? How would the local sheriff react if word reached town? The nearest settlement was a few miles away, but that was not far when someone was curious or afraid. Near midday, she spotted dust rising on the far side of the ridge. Her heart jumped. She shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted. Two riders were coming down the slope, not in a hurry but with a steady pace. She knew the horses and the silhouettes well enough. One belonged to a neighbor, a narrow-faced man who watched everything with suspicion. The other belonged to a younger fellow who spent more time talking about danger than actually facing it. She swallowed hard. If they saw the camp, they would not keep it to themselves. She hurried halfway between her cabin and the field, then forced herself to slow down. Running toward the riders would only draw more attention. She steadied her breathing as they drew closer. When they reached the fence, their eyes widened as they took in the camp spread across her land. The older neighbor pulled his horse to a sharp stop, his jaw tightening. The younger man cursed under his breath. They asked her what in the world she thought she was doing. Did she know who those people were? Did she realize what kind of trouble she was inviting? The younger one pointed at the Apache warriors, calling them dangerous, saying they had probably come to use her place as a staging ground. His words came sharp and fast, fed by fear and anger. The older neighbor said less, but his eyes were cold as he studied the camp and then her face. She answered in as steady a voice as she could manage. She explained that the warrior had come to her wounded, that she had helped him, and that his people were only resting here for a short time. She said they had not harmed her, stolen from her, or made any threats. She spoke of how they treated her with respect, how they stayed within the boundaries of the field, how they were families, not raiders. But her words felt small against the wall of fear she saw building in the riders' faces. The older neighbor said it was not about what had happened yet, but what could happen. He warned her that if soldiers heard about this, they might come down hard on everyone in sight, including her. The younger man muttered that the sheriff needed to know at once. The camp was too big to ignore. If she would not protect herself, others would have to step in. He turned his horse as if ready to ride back immediately. For a moment, time felt thin. She realized this could be the turning point. If they rode into town full of fear and anger, the story would grow teeth. Men would gather rifles, and the field that now held cooking fires and children's laughter could turn into something far darker. She found herself stepping closer to the fence, her voice firmer than she expected. She asked them to wait, at least for a day. She said riding into town right away would only stir things up. The Apache camp was peaceful, and rushing would only bring bloodshed none of them truly wanted. The older neighbor hesitated. He knew her as the quiet woman who kept to herself, paid her small debts, and never caused trouble. He had never seen her stand so tall, her voice tight but unshaken. The younger man argued, but the older one finally held up a hand to silence him. He agreed to hold off for a short time, but only that. He said if the camp did not move on, or if anything happened to nearby settlers or cattle, he would ride into town himself. No more talk, no more waiting. As the riders left, the tension in her chest remained. She knew she had only bought a little time. The main conflict was no longer hiding. It had stepped into the open. A quiet homestead woman had become a bridge between an Apache camp and settlers already close to fear. And the worst part was that any wrong step from either side could push all of them over an edge, back near the center of the camp. The leader and the scarred warrior had watched the exchange from a distance, their expressions unreadable. When she walked back to them, the warrior asked what the men had said. She did not hide the truth. She told them about the threat of soldiers, about the sheriff, about the fear spreading faster than facts. The leader listened with a face that had seen too many seasons of the same pattern. He spoke quietly with the warrior and a few others, weighing choices that would affect every person under his watch. Some of the younger Apache men looked frustrated, their eyes flashing with anger at the idea of being driven off again. Others looked tired, as if they had seen this all before and knew how it could end. As the afternoon wore on, small subplots unfolded around them. The young boy who had almost fallen earlier appeared at her porch with a small woven charm, clearly made in a hurry. He offered it to her with both hands, eyes bright with shy pride. She accepted it, feeling its rough texture against her fingers. She thanked him and tied it to a nail beside her door. It felt like a symbol of a fragile trust trying to grow in the middle of gathering danger. Later, one of the Apache women approached her with a basket of dried herbs. Through gestures and a few words, she explained how they could help with pain and fever. The woman realized the basket was meant as a gift, a way to repay kindness with kindness. She accepted it, her heart pulled in two directions. One side felt warmth at these small gestures. The other heard the echo of hooves on hard ground and the promise of armed men coming if things did not change quickly. As evening fell again, the campfires lit up her field like small stars scattered across the earth. The warrior walked once more to her porch. He told her there were different voices in the camp. Some wanted to move on to safer ground. Others believed they should stand firm and not keep running every time someone threatened them. He stood between those choices, just as she stood between settlers and his people. The weight of it pressed heavily on both of them. They talked longer than before, sharing small pieces of their past. She spoke of why she lived alone, how loss had driven her to this quiet place where she thought trouble would pass her by. He shared what little he could in broken words about battles fought, brothers gone, promises made to elders who believed there could still be some balance between their people and the new settlers. Every shared memory tightened the invisible threads between them. But when the sky turned fully dark, he stepped away, leaving her alone on the porch with only the glow of distant fires. She could feel the story of her life changing shape, pulled by forces she could no longer ignore. Out there in the night, two worlds were circling each other, and she stood at the point where they would either collide or find a narrow path through. In the quiet that followed, she heard a faint sound on the wind, different from laughter, different from the crackle of flames. It was the far-off echo of hooves and metal, like more riders moving somewhere beyond the ridge. She could not see them yet. She only knew that they were coming. The echo of distant hooves stayed with her long after the night settled in. She kept standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the faint glow of the Apache campfires spread across her field like a blanket of quiet light. Everything looked peaceful from where she stood, but her heart felt like it was fighting against a tightening rope. She knew the riders beyond the ridge were not part of the Apache camp. No child laughed in that direction. No elder tended a fire. The sound of metal carried on the wind with the kind of rhythm that came from men preparing for trouble. She stayed there until the cold began to sink through her clothes. Then went inside, though sleep hardly found her at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her neighbors riding into town, telling stories warped by fear. She saw soldiers marching in lines, rifles raised, not stopping long enough to hear the truth. She saw the warrior standing between two worlds, carrying the weight of a promise he had made to her and to his people. By dawn, her eyes were sore, and the tension in her shoulders felt like iron when morning came. She stepped outside and saw the camp already awake and alert. There was less laughter than before. The men moved with purpose, speaking in low tones. Elders gathered their things with organized care, as though ready to move if needed. She noticed the warrior speaking to two younger men, his voice quiet but firm. He caught sight of her near the porch and walked toward her with a seriousness that made her stomach twist. He told her the riders she heard last night might be scouts. If soldiers were nearby, they needed time to decide if they should stay or leave. He explained that the leader had been in enough conflicts to know the signs. The camp had to prepare for whatever came. She asked him what they planned to do, but he only said they were not ready to choose yet. Too many voices were pulling in different directions. Some believed they should move at once. Others believed that leaving under pressure would make them appear weak. Inviting more threats later, she understood their struggle, but fear still lodged in her chest. She told him quietly that she had stood up for them when the two neighbors came, but she did not know how long that would hold. He nodded, his eyes dark with concern. He thanked her again for what she had done, though thanks felt like a thin shield against what might come. As the day warmed, a sense of heavy waiting settled across her land. She walked among her vegetables, checking the soil, though her hands shook with every touch. She saw the older Apache woman who had spoken to her days ago, watching her from a distance with an expression both gentle and weighted. The children played less boldly than before, staying closer to their mothers. Even the horses seemed restless, shifting their feet, ears flicking at every small sound from the hills. By late morning, the tension reached a point where the air itself felt tight. The leader gathered his people near the center of the camp and spoke to them in a strong voice. Though she did not understand the words, she could see how each syllable carried weight. Men nodded with grave expressions. Women straightened their backs. Even the youngest children paused. When the leader finished, the camp split into groups. One prepared traveling packs. Another reinforced the horses' gear. A few climbed the ridge edges to watch for movement. She stood near her porch, eyes darting between the Apache camp and the hills. She wished she could stop the world and force everyone to sit down and hear the truth. But the frontier had never worked that way. Fear traveled faster than kindness. Rumor was louder than reason. And the distance between two ways of life was sometimes too wide to cross in time. Around midday, the warrior approached her again. This time, there was something in his eyes that cut deeper than any of his words. He asked her to come with him to the ridge. He wanted her to see something for herself. She followed, her boots crunching on dry dirt as they moved through the field. When they reached the far edge, he lifted a hand and pointed. In the distance, just barely visible between stretches of sunlit grass, a small line of riders was moving. Not rushing, not hiding. Just moving with a steady, deliberate pace. Her breath caught, and she felt her hands go cold. She asked him quietly if those were soldiers. He did not answer right away, but the silence said enough. The riders wore shapes that looked too organized, too uniform. She knew that once soldiers got involved, things could spiral faster than anyone could stop. A single misunderstanding could ignite something that no one intended. They stood there for a long moment, watching the distant shapes move. The camp behind them stayed unaware for the moment, but that would not last long. She could feel the warrior's tension in the air beside her. She sensed how much he wanted to protect his people, how he carried responsibility heavier than most men his age. When he finally turned to her, his voice was low. He said they needed to prepare for the worst while hoping for something better. Back at the camp, the leader gathered everyone again. The warrior spoke next, explaining what they saw. The younger Apache men looked ready to fight. Their shoulders tightened, hands flexing near weapons. Mothers held their children close. Elders whispered to one another. The leader lifted a hand, signaling for calm, but even he could not mask the worry in his eyes. She stepped forward before she realized what she was doing. She told them she would go into town before nightfall and see if she could learn more about the riders. She said soldiers might only be passing through, and panicking could make things worse. The leader studied her quietly, weighing her intentions. The warrior looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. He told her it was dangerous to walk into town alone while the settlers were already uneasy. But she insisted. She said she could not stand by and wait for fear to decide their fate. After a long silence, the leader nodded. He said she could go, but she must return by sunset. No later, she promised she would. The warrior stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. He told her not to trust everything she heard in town. Fear made men say things they did not fully believe. She nodded, wanting to tell him she understood that she was scared too, but courage was not the same as having no fear. Instead, she simply said she would be careful. Before leaving, she went to her cabin and filled a small bag with essentials. The warrior waited near the fence. His gaze followed her hands as she tied the strap of the bag. When she approached, he hesitated as though he wanted to say something important but did not know how. Finally, he told her that if soldiers came sooner than expected, the camp would move into the hills. He wanted her to know where to find them if she needed safety. She swallowed hard and nodded. Holding his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to, the journey to town felt longer than usual. Every sound in the grass made her jump. Every shadow made her think of riders hidden just beyond sight. When she finally reached the edge of town, she saw small clusters of settlers gathered near the general store, talking in low, tense voices. A few of them glanced her way with uneasy suspicion, as though her presence meant something they did not fully trust. She walked toward the sheriff's office, hoping to hear something before she was seen. But when she reached the doorway, she froze. Inside, several men stood around the sheriff, talking in fast, heated tones. She recognized her older neighbor, his face tight with worry. The younger neighbor spoke louder, telling the sheriff that an Apache camp had gathered on her land, and that she was either hiding something or had fallen under their influence. He said the settlers needed to act fast before something bad happened. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the wooden desk. His face showed strain. He said they had gotten word from West patrols that a group of soldiers was already moving nearby. The soldiers claimed they were looking for a band of Apache warriors seen several days ago. They feared it might be the same group now gathered on her land. If that was true, the situation was already unstable. She felt as though a rope tightened around her heart. She stepped inside so they could see her. The men fell silent, some turning toward her with disbelief, others with anger. The sheriff looked at her with a mixture of relief and frustration. He asked her directly if the Apache camp was peaceful or if the neighbors were right to worry. She told him the truth. They were families resting, not raiding. They had harmed no one and had shown respect for her land. She said sending soldiers would only start trouble where none existed. Her voice trembled, but she kept speaking, knowing she had only one chance to plant doubt before fear overtook everything. The sheriff listened, but she could see he was torn. The younger neighbor shouted that she was being fooled, that no woman alone could handle a camp like that. The room burst into arguments. The sheriff finally raised his hand, but before he could settle things, another deputy rushed in with news that soldiers were closer than expected. They would arrive by nightfall. Her stomach dropped. She realized she had run out of time. She left the office before anyone could stop her. She hurried through the streets, her heart pounding, knowing the camp needed to know what she had heard. As she mounted her horse and started toward home, she could feel the pressure of everything tightening at once. Soldiers approaching, settlers panicking, the Apache camp preparing for whatever might come. And she, caught between all of it, riding into a future that felt heavier than anything she had ever faced. When she reached the ridge above her land, the sun was already slipping low. The Apache camp's fires flickered in the distance. The people moving like shadows, preparing for decisions no one wanted to make, the moment she reached the field. The warrior ran toward her, eyes sharp with urgency. She could hardly breathe as she told him the soldiers would arrive by nightfall. The leader approached, and the camp grew quiet, the entire field shifting into a single, waiting heartbeat. The warrior looked at her. Standing so close, she could see every line in his scarred face, every unspoken word resting behind his eyes. The leader nodded slowly, knowing choices had run out. The field felt charged with fear, hope, and the last fragile chance to prevent something terrible. Everything now balanced on what happened next. The sun hung low over the horizon, stretching long shadows across her field, turning the Apache camp into a quiet sea of figures waiting for direction. The warrior stood beside her, breathing hard from worry, not exhaustion. The leader stepped into the open with his calm, steady presence, and the entire camp gathered around him, looking to him for a choice that would shape all their futures. She felt her heart twist as she realized how much these families depended on a calm path through danger, and how much of that path had somehow begun with her simple act of giving a wounded man a bed. The warrior listened to the leader speak to his people in a strong, steady voice. His words carried a mix of caution and hope. He spoke about the soldiers approaching, about the settlers' fear, and about the need to keep everyone safe. He reminded them that conflict only led to more loss, and that peace, though hard to maintain, was worth fighting for in its own way. The camp listened closely, their faces lit by the soft, trembling glow of their fires. When the leader finished, he turned to her, asking softly what she believed the soldiers intended. She told him the truth as best she could. The soldiers were coming because they were afraid and misinformed. They were not arriving to hurt families, but they would react quickly if they felt threatened. If they saw weapons drawn, everything would spiral. But if the Apache camp showed calm instead of panic, there might still be a chance for peace. She said the settlement respected the sheriff, and if he arrived with the soldiers, he might listen, and they might avoid a fight none of them wanted. The leader nodded slowly, weighing each word. Then he faced his people again and said that they would not run that night. Running meant surrendering the hope that this land could ever hold peace. It meant teaching the children that fear decided everything. They would stay calm, gather together, put away weapons, and wait. Not helpless, not unguarded, but steady. His voice carried the weight of wisdom, and the camp obeyed. She could feel her legs tremble as the sky darkened and the first distant glow of lanterns appeared beyond the ridge. The warrior stepped closer, his voice low. He told her he was grateful she had come back to warn them in time. She felt her chest tighten at the sincerity in his tone. He said her courage had given them a chance they would not have had otherwise. She told him he had given her something too, though she struggled to express it. He had shown her trust she had not expected from anyone, especially someone from a world so different from hers. Their eyes held each other for a moment, filled with meaning that words could not reach. The sound of hooves grew louder. Torches flickered against the sky as soldiers rode toward the fence. Behind them, the sheriff and a few townsmen followed. The tension in the field thickened like a storm rolling in. Children clung to their mothers. Young men who had earlier been ready to defend themselves now stood with their hands visible, their faces set with resolve. The warrior remained by her side, though every instinct in him likely urged him to step forward and protect his people. The sheriff rode ahead of the soldiers, lifting a hand as he approached. His horse slowed to a stop near the fence, and he took in the sight of the peaceful, organized camp before him. He saw no raised weapons, no signs of danger. He saw families, elders, and children standing together with quiet dignity. The leader stood tall in front of them, greeting the sheriff with calm respect. The sheriff let out a long breath. He turned to the commanding officer of the soldiers and told him they would handle this peacefully. The officer frowned, clearly tense, but he did not argue. Instead, he ordered his men to stay mounted and hold their position. The tension eased only a little, but it was enough for the woman to step forward beside the warrior. She walked to the fence, her voice steady, though her heart raced. She told the sheriff the truth about what had happened. She told him she had given shelter to a wounded Apache man, that his people had come to thank her, and that they meant no harm. She said they had done nothing wrong, harmed no one, and had only sought a place to rest for a short time. Every word she spoke came from honesty, not fear, and the sheriff could see that. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably as the leader stepped forward and addressed the sheriff through careful English. He spoke of wanting peace, of protecting his families, of not wishing for conflict. He said they were willing to move soon and only needed time to gather their things and find a safe direction. His voice was humble but firm, showing strength without threat. The sheriff nodded slowly. He looked around at the gathered soldiers and neighbors, then said loudly that there was no need for violence. He ordered the soldiers to stand down. The officer hesitated, but the sheriff stood between the two groups with a conviction that could not be challenged. After a tense pause, the officer gave a short command, and the soldiers lowered their rifles. A deep breath went through the entire field, like the whole land had been holding it. The neighbors who had worried most looked confused but relieved. The older one lowered his head, realizing the danger had passed. The younger one looked embarrassed, but he said nothing. The soldiers stayed alert but calm, waiting for further orders. As the fires flickered under the settling night, the sheriff agreed to let the Apache camp stay until dawn. He trusted them to leave peacefully, and they trusted him to keep his word. It was not a perfect solution, but it was enough to avoid disaster, enough to keep families safe, enough to turn fear into a fragile but hopeful calm. The camp prepared quietly through the night, packing their belongings with care. Elders offered soft blessings, children clung to the last bits of warmth from the fires, and warriors helped one another shoulder their supplies. She walked among them, helping where she could, accepting small gifts they offered to her as tokens of gratitude. Woven charms, dried herbs, small wooden carvings. Each one carried a piece of their trust. As dawn approached, the leader came to her and thanked her with a steady voice. He said the camp would move toward safer ground, deep into the hills, away from the settlements. He hoped one day the land would know more peace than fear. She nodded, feeling both relief and sadness fill her in equal measure. The warrior approached last. He stood before her in the soft light of morning, his scars gentle against the glow. He said he would not forget her kindness, that no matter where his people traveled next, her name would be spoken with respect among them. She felt her breath catch as he lifted a hand and lightly touched the woven charm tied beside her door. A symbol of the thread their lives had shared. She wished him safety, wished his people peace, and wished the world were gentler so paths like theirs could meet without danger. He held her gaze one last time, then turned to join his people. The Apache camp moved quietly across her field, disappearing into the hills just as the sun broke across the open sky. The soldiers rode away too, leaving nothing but the faint echo of hooves. The sheriff lingered only long enough to tell her she had done something brave, something that would not be forgotten by anyone who had seen the truth that night. When she finally stood alone, her field was empty again, but it no longer felt lonely. The land held the memory of courage, trust, and a fragile peace that had survived the edge of disaster. She walked back to her cabin with a heart fuller than she expected. The woven charm beside her door swayed in the morning breeze, reminding her that kindness could change the course of a story, even on the roughest frontier. And though the warrior and his people disappeared into the hills, she carried the quiet certainty that their paths would remain tied in a way that no fear could undo. The frontier had tested them, but kindness had given all of them a chance to step into a better day.